The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Keith, Justine, and Vaughn have known each other a long time. I'm guessing Justine was in diapers when they all met, and now we count on the three of them to explain to us what's going on in BC politics.
And good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and here we are halfway gone in the BC legislature session, coming up on the first anniversary of last year's incredible election, and delighted to have on the show tonight a couple of old friends who I have known and worked with for more than 30 years. Justine Hunter, thanks for being back.
Always great to be here.
You were only 5 when you started in the press gallery.
Old enough to vote,
yes. And Keith Baldrey, good to have you back as well.
Great to be here. Always a fun time with the three of us. So Justine was not in diapers. I know. I remember when she started, she wore a torn T-shirt and spiky blonde hair and stuff, but no, older than that.
We'll have a picture of me later on in the show, and we can laugh at that, and I guarantee you Justine has never looked anything as undignified as the picture you have of me coming later. So the last 10 days, we have been talking pretty much nothing but pipelines and trying to explain to Canada, that place on the other side of the Rockies that never understands British Columbia, what the hell's going on out here. So, Keith, what's the story?
Well, it changes every day. So the latest development today was an Angus Reid poll that shows support for the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion is starting to inch up, 54% now. It's up, I think, 6 points since whole in February. And opposition is starting to decline. But that's just one thing. Also today, Kinder Morgan put another note to their investors saying, as it stands now, the project is untenable, in their words, because of what they feel to be the delaying tactics of the BC government, a lot of which I think is conjecture on their part rather than reality. But again, it just doesn't mean the pipeline's dead. You know, Ottawa and Alberta have signaled that if need be, they are prepared to step in and ensure this thing is built on their terms, perhaps with a consortium of partners. But it's an ever-evolving story, and it's a fascinating one.
British Columbia government is still planning to go to court. It no longer thinks it can legally stop the pipeline, but they do think they can bring in regulations that affect its operations. And we had a bit of a briefing on that today from Attorney General David Eby.
That's right. He and the Environment Minister, George Heyman, came out and met with reporters to announce that they've set a date that they will be bringing into the highest court in British Columbia, the Court of Appeal, the reference question by the end of this month. So we don't know what the question is. We have an idea of what it will be. It's going to be talking about looking at how the provinces do have a complementary obligation under the Constitution to regulate matters of the environment. There's been a number of cases to that effect. So yes, the federal government does have the supreme power to decide whether or not this pipeline is built. The question is whether BC can confirm that what it says is its jurisdiction to regulate matters of the environment and perhaps control what comes out of the pipeline. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that's interesting to note is at the same time that Kinder Morgan is saying this project is untenable, we can't go ahead with it, we're slowing down all non-essential construction. They're in the middle of just going into negotiations with Ottawa and the Alberta government about what those two jurisdictions are willing to do financially to help remove any risk from this project. So it's quite an unusual situation. Mm-hmm. You have a $7.4 billion pipeline, perhaps even more, and you've got two governments willing to say, we'll backstop that. And if the federal government and Alberta put money into this pipeline now, the pressure on BC is going to be that much higher because you've now got the BC government saying we're going to do everything we can to try and regulate this issue of the increased flow of oil through BC against Canadian taxpayers' dollars, which will make it a different dynamic altogether. But all BC is doing is they're asking for an opinion of the courts about whether they can do this or not. They're not actually throwing legislation across and trying to stop it that way. And they're also continuing to issue permits as requested from Kinder Morgan. So there's nothing that Kinder Morgan can point to where they can say BC has effectively tried to stop this pipeline. It's all, just as Keith says, conjecture on the part of the company and on the part of Alberta to say this is what BC is trying to do.
Two more developments that we should note before moving on. One is this piece of legislation they brought in Alberta this week.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so this is Bill 12, Ensuring Canadian Prosperity Act, something like that. Weird title, but it's basically giving the Alberta government the power to set up a licensing system to regulate the flow of petroleum products outside the province. It doesn't mention BC. It's just a 7-page bill. It's not a very complicated one, but it will allow them to literally turn up the amount of product flowing out of the province, or reducing the flow. So the implications, of course, they could reduce the amount of fuel headed BC's way by a significant amount. And if oil companies don't cooperate and follow the rules as set down by the energy minister, they face very hefty fines of, I think, $10 million a day for any day that they don't follow the law. And most energy analysts, gasoline analysts, suggest that if they were to do that in any appreciable amount, gas prices in Metro Vancouver would soon hit at least $2 a liter, perhaps even more. And that would start changing, I think, the sort of the parameters of the debate we're having over the pipeline, and make it a lot more hitting home in a more personal way in your wallet, that you will see a personal stake one way or another of whether this project goes ahead. Now, I've talked to Notley's people. No indication this is going to happen anytime soon. This is something designed to show everybody they think they've got the power. David Eby says, no, constitutionally it's not going to stand up. If Alberta were to enact this, he would be in court immediately seeking an injunction to stop it. It could get ugly, as Justine pointed out, the regulating bitumen. If BC gets to the point of regulating Alberta's bitumen, Alberta may well respond and say, you mess with our bitumen, we're going to mess with your gas. But I think we're a long way from that.
Yeah, and if one province can stop one's bitumen, maybe the other one can do gasoline, but I think both issues will end up in court. Justine, I did want to mention one other thing. The Provincial Prosecution Service, which is independent, announced this week that they were going to take charge of the prosecution of the people who've been arrested for defying the court injunction around the project, and those people may face criminal charges.
That's right. So the justice in this case had said in the court that it wasn't appropriate for Kinder Morgan to have to, as a private litigant, handle all of these cases. There's more than 140 people who have been arrested, including 2 MPs. Kennedy Stewart and Elizabeth May, the head of the Federal Green Party. So they've got all these people coming in. They've been charged under a civil injunction that Kinder Morgan sought to get protesters away from their operations on Burnaby Mountain. So what is happening now is as an independent agency, an arm of the Attorney General, the Prosecution Services has agreed to take over those prosecutions. So it's no longer Kinder Morgan having to carry the can. And it does mean that they can be raised up as and face potentially jail or fines or both. So the more significant consequences. But it also changes what happens in court, because you're no longer able to really question under these if it's a criminal prosecution. You can't say, well, my defense is that I felt it was important to do this for Mother Earth or any other reason. All you have to answer is the question, yes or no. Did you know there was an injunction that said you couldn't do this? Because this is now contempt of court, and it's a much more straightforward and simple prosecution.
And some people have made the point that civil disobedience is one thing, but being found guilty of criminal contempt can affect your career and your ability to travel and a lot of other things.
If you have a criminal record, you can be stopped at the border. It can impair your ability to travel. It can impair future employment possibilities. And I think it's incumbent among the protest organizers to inform anybody who's about to go down this road what the implications are of a criminal contempt citation and charge and being found guilty. The stakes are considerably higher, much higher than a civil contempt proceeding. So we'll see if going forward we see as many people willing to be arrested as we've seen in the past, now that the stakes, I think, are considerably higher.
And an unfair question, but what the heck. The Prime Minister said on the weekend that this pipeline is going to get built, and he indicated construction should start this summer. Do you think it'll happen?
I'm not sure about construction starting this summer. And I think there's a lot of hurdles that still have to be cleared. The Prime Minister and Rachel Notley, the Premier of Alberta, have identified John Horgan as the obstacle in this. John Horgan is not the only obstacle in this, and there are a number. The Federal Court of Appeal
still has
not ruled, and that could strip the permit away, the federal permit. There's another case seeking to overturn the provincial authorization of this project, and now we've got this reference case. So none of those, I don't think, are going to be resolved entirely to Kinder Morgan's satisfaction by their self-imposed deadline of May 31st. So whether they're satisfied with what Ottawa is willing to bail them out with is going to be the question. But it's up to that company to decide whether the risk has been removed.
Well, yeah, I agree. The prospects of construction beginning in earnest, I don't think are very high. There's a lot of, as Justine mentioned, a lot of unresolved issues out there. But having said that, Justin Trudeau on that weekend summit in Ottawa with Notley and Horgan made it very clear he's gone all in on building this pipeline. And he's staked his entire political future to this project. And he's let it be known that it has to go ahead. So he's going to do everything he can in his power to get this thing going. Maybe it doesn't happen this summer. Kinder Morgan says they want to start by the end of May because of the schedule. You can't necessarily build a lot of this stuff in the dead of winter through the route of British Columbia. But Trudeau's made a political calculation here. And if this pipeline is not built, I think his career just flames out.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what both of them have said. The courts could still stop this. We are still awaiting a major decision of the Federal Court of Appeal, and it's taken them a long time, and you never know what the courts are going to do. But if the courts say go ahead, I think construction will start, although I agree it may not be full bore over this summer because there still are a lot of hurdles to clear. There are a lot of other things to talk about. And I mentioned that, this time last year, Keith and Justine and I were already starting to cover a provincial election campaign, which had a rather surprising outcome, one that we're still digesting a year later. Let's start with a question from Richard Zussman.
We're closing in now on the 1-year anniversary since the historic 2017 election. How do you think the political landscape fundamentally has changed in British Columbia since that election?
Well, you can start by reading the book that Richard and Rob wrote, Rob Shaw, who's going to have the next question. It's changed a lot.
Yeah, and I think you've got a dynamic we haven't seen here in generations in terms of a minority government. It's a minority government that's supported with a third party, the Green Party, that has unprecedented for its 3 members, an incredible amount of influence on the government. And we've seen decisions that probably none of us could have predicted. The NDP government going ahead with the Site C dam. We've also seen, I think, the beginning of a fundamental shift in terms of the redistribution of wealth. I think that the changes that are happening on the tax front is really changing, and the government has taken it as a mandate to say we're going to invest in things like daycare and housing. And yes, taxes are going to go up to pay for it. There's some controversial changes around real estate. But there's a beginning of, I think, some big changes.
Yeah, and we don't change governments very often in this province. The 3 of us have been on this beat for more than 30 years, and we've seen 3 changes of government. It happens every 10, 12, 16 years. So this was a sea change by changing government after 16 years. So the landscape is completely different than what we've been used to for well more than a decade. And with the emergence of this third party that is propping up a government in power, we've had third parties before, but not in this situation where you've got a minority government situation. So I think there's a fundamental re-altering of the political landscape on top of some of the policies that we're seeing from the new NDP government. Keep in mind, though, they are continuing, controversially, a number of Liberal policies, which is building Site C, inviting the LNG industry into BC, keeping the BC Ferry Corp inside of government.
Outside of government.
Outside of government, not bringing it in, as they were saying in opposition. They had to drop a number of their opposition policies as they get their heads around the reality of governing. So things have changed big time.
And they're keeping us incredibly busy, even without something like the Kinder Morgan issue, which British Columbia didn't entirely invite that one. There's a lot going on here. We're very, very busy. Rob Shaw has a question, and he is the other guy who, with Zussman, wrote the book on this, literally, A Matter of Confidence. So here is Rob.
We've seen John Horgan have to handle on his own several question periods this session. I'm just interested, Keith and Justine, what your take is on his evolution as a leader and as a premier, and what kind of version of John Horgan you see now when he pops up in question period.
Yeah, well, I think he's doing a very good job. I'm very impressed with his performance so far. And, you go back to a year ago from now, he was in a very shaky position. I mean, in the run-up before the last election, he seemed to be floundering. He seemed to be unconfident. He seemed to be panicking at times. He was lashing out at the media, seemed to be lacking confidence. And as the campaign went on, he gained confidence, and since literally he made one mistake in the campaign. And since then, I think he's been just this transformation of a guy who I think was frustrated by being in opposition, who was very comfortable being in government, very confident and enjoying himself. In fact, I've told him, I said, we've all covered a lot of premiers. I can't remember a premier who's actually enjoyed himself or herself in the job as much as John Horgan seems to be doing. I give him a pretty high mark right now.
Your take on him, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, you think about, he was a reluctant leader. He didn't want to run for the leadership. He sort of said, oh, it's time for some new blood. He kind of got drafted into that position. He was characterized in the last election a year ago as Angry John. He seemed to be very bitter and frustrated and lashing out. And we all predicted, I think, that his temper would get the better of him. But when you watched him in Ottawa on Sunday, under tremendous pressure, he's facing full court press from Alberta, from the Prime Minister, all these threats over his head about what they can do to BC. And he managed to keep his cool. He came out and said, you know what? I understand this, we have a disagreement, but we're going to continue doing what I said we would do, and he's laid it out as best he can. So I think he was under a lot of pressure, and he actually came out looking very calm.
I interviewed former Cabinet Minister Bill Bennett a little while back and asked him what he thought. Now, he likes Horgan as a person, but he nevertheless said he thought that so far he would give the government, the Premier, a B+. Now, Bill was delighted that they went ahead with Site C because he supported the project, so that's where he's coming from. But B+, not a bad rating from somebody that tried everything they could do to keep you from ever getting into power. So, interesting rating. Let's see if we can get this one out of the way before the break. Richard Zussman.
This is a question for all of you. We're now closing in on the end of the legislative session, but there are still a lot of big pieces of legislation the NDP have to put forward. What do you think those critical pieces of legislation are? Yeah,
there's signs of getting bogged down. They're not getting everything done in the time they have.
Yeah, we were told the cannabis legislation was many facets of that, and that's a huge part that's delayed. We're told a lot of the drafting capacity within the legislature. So all of those bills, or whether they roll it all into one, that's a big piece. We're expecting some significant changes at ICBC with how they go after bad drivers. They're still just getting that feedback from the public before they draft those. There's, I think, an important piece, probably won't get a lot of attention, but changes to the way that the child welfare is handled, where they're going to be bringing in Indigenous communities to have more say. I think it's an important change and a sensitive one. They can't just sort of write that one on the back of the napkin. So those are some big changes still to come.
Yeah, the cannabis,
all this stuff drafted.
Yeah, as Justine says, they have a problem with resources. Especially, there's specialists who are actually trained to write legislation. Not anybody can do that, and they need a lot of experience. And I think there's been some retirees and haven't been replaced. So the resources there to draft legislation don't seem to be as high as is required. Also, they're getting into this kind of late in terms of just being a new government and trying to figure out how everything works. The cannabis stuff's going to be interesting. Mike Farnworth, the government House Leader, told me some time ago 18 different pieces of legislation had to be amended. He thinks that number's dropped a bit, and as Justine alluded to, he's probably going to consolidate them in one or two bills, sort of omnibus miscellaneous statutes type bills. But everything from that affects residential tenancy laws, strata laws, motor vehicle laws, corrections laws, some health laws, all of them are impacted by the legalization of cannabis, and that's a challenge I think that Farnworth's facing. Get those in front of the House. He says he's not going to extend the session, but boy, he's running out of time in terms of getting this stuff done.
One of the things that always goes on in a legislature session, too, is the opposition does try to show that the government can't quite manage its affairs. They drag things out. They dare them to put stuff off to the fall. They dare them to bring in closure and end debate. And I think you're going to see some of that games playing going on in the next few weeks, too, maybe with a view to trying to get the government to either extend the session or put stuff over to the fall. On that note, we'll take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us. We'll be right back with the media panel.
Vaughn Palmer, there is no doubt you are an institution in BC politics. I was shocked to read that you were actually there at WAC Bennett's leadership convention for the Social Credit Party. You didn't seem quite that old. But congratulations on 20 years. You've done incredible work on Voice of BC, and we look forward to seeing you continue and reading you in the Vancouver Sun every day.
Vaughn, let me acknowledge you by your name, V-A-U-G-H-N. V is for your veracity and your versatility. A, because you actually are very amiable. U, well, you have been not only unifying, but you've also been unscripted. G, well, great, good, you take your pick. H, you've also been very heated at times. N, well, let's say you can choose as well, naughty or nice.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Vaughn, since you started hosting Voice of BC back in 1998, 20 long years ago, a lot of things have changed. We've had new lieutenant governors, new prime ministers, new MPs, new MLAs, new premiers, new cabinet ministers. Gordon Wilson even had 3 parties in that period of time. And yet you've remained a constant, fixed on the horizon, the host of Voice of BC. Congratulations.
Welcome back, and the general agreement during the break is that the G in Vaughn stands for geek. And if you have any doubt about that, there's a picture coming up later that will settle the issue once and for all. We'll go back to some questions on tape. We mentioned some things the government got right and some controversies as well. But I think they put their foot wrong on one thing, and here with a question about it is Bruce Halser.
I'm curious if you can recall a situation where a government announced a major new tax in its budget, within a couple of weeks was telling people that the tax wasn't going to be what they actually said it was going to be, and they'd let people know in the fall. And then a couple of weeks later, they changed the tax again. All the same time, there's no change to how much the tax is going to be collected in terms of estimates. It seems like that's making tax policy on the fly, causing a lot of concern for British Columbians, and we wonder how much effect it will have on the housing market anyway. Can you recall any kind of similar budget announcement that was introduced with less preparation and more uncertainty?
Well, this is a speculation tax, and I think some of what Bruce said there is fair comment. What do you think?
Yeah, it did appear on the first day when Carol James tabled her budget. She got overall very good reviews. There was a huge suite of changes around real estate, and people like Jock Finlayson from the BC Business Council said, you know, on balance, this looks like it might be a good package. But when we started asking specific questions in the ensuing days, it became clear that there were a whole bunch of people that were going to be caught up that weren't speculators. And Carol James then started to kind of redefine what this tax was all about. So it's a tax about fairness. It's about making people from away pay their fair share. Or on another day, it's a different definition. So in the end, they have, yes, they've walked it back. They've whittled it down. There's still concerns around it. I suspect we may see even further changes before the final regulations are brought in. But all along, they've said there's a $200 million revenue to come in from this. I think that number was pulled out of thin air because they had no idea how much money that was, and so there's no point changing it until they finalize it.
Yeah, and the other thing we don't have yet, and won't have till the fall, that is unusual, is we haven't got the actual legislation.
Or the regulations.
We can speculate whatever the hell we want about what's in it, but
we've got a
we
news
don't
release.
know.
We've got a news release. That's it. We haven't got the actual language. We haven't got the regulations. And now to Bruce Halser's point about is this the unprecedented? Well, in the 1990s, Glenn Clark's first or second budget when he was finance minister, he brought in a tax which I think was on high-end homes, if I recall. Yeah. And Mike Harcourt, the premier, was living on the west side of Vancouver and started to hear earfuls of criticism from his neighbors that this was unfair, and Clark had to dial it back. So that was one that was also trotted out, bungled, and pulled back. This one has been bungled, and as you say, we don't know how badly bungled it is because we haven't got the details.
Andrew McLeod from the Tyee with a question about, well, this is a daily question over the legislature, which changes regularly and is very stimulating to those of us in the news media and maybe a bit frustrating to some other people, but, well, you know what, we live off in this business, so controversy. So here's Andrew.
Every few weeks, Andrew Weaver seems to return to threatening to bring down the government over one issue or another. I'm wondering, in your view, how serious he is and what the uncertainty that brings says about the future for electoral reform.
This week, he was just on the rampage in the House. He is mercurial, I think it's fair to say.
I think he's going over the line the last few instances. Yesterday, he went just really angry because he wasn't in the House when he wanted to pass some amendments, so the committee staged passing. He wasn't able to get on the floor, so he had to go on a harangue for an hour. This is somehow an assault on democracy. His problem right now is the other parties are laughing at him with his outbursts. He's the #1 heckler in question period. You and I sit there in the front row behind the speaker, so we hear what people don't hear on television, and he is the loudest heckler than anybody in the House. Yet he decries that type of behavior. So I think he's a bit erratic right now, and again, he's running the risk of becoming less respected by his peers than he was at the time of the turnover of government. So it'll be interesting whether he curbs his enthusiasm for these outbursts, but he's not contributing to the notion that a minority government looks really stable and functioning all the time when not the partner, but the person propping you up does have this mercurial performance in the House, and it's becoming more frequent.
But he said he was going to bring the government down over LNG, and he sounds pretty serious on that. He's given them till fall. Do you think he'll go ahead?
See, I don't think so. I think he's still, despite all the bluster, I think he's very focused on electoral reform. And I think he knows that, he's a smart guy. He knows that if he pulls the government down right now on something like LNG or over the Site C Dam, you're going to end up with, most likely, a majority Liberal government or a majority NDP government. Mm-hmm. You're certainly not going to end up with a majority Green government. He is not going to have the kind of influence, if he pulls the government down, that he has right now. So his best opportunity to influence government policy is to maintain the status quo right now. And the only way you're going to get to that electoral reform referendum is to maintain it for at least another year.
I've never heard Sonia Furstenau or Adam Olsen threaten to bring the NDP government down, and I'm not convinced. I mean, they say they don't have a whip vote. They're free to vote whichever way they want. I've seen no evidence that necessarily they would bring the NDP government down. Back to Zussman and Shaw's book, there's a great anecdote in there about Sonia Furstenau being almost physically ill at the notion of even talking to the BC Liberals about keeping them in power. I can't imagine her doing anything that would open up the possibility that just after a year or two in government that there's a possibility the Liberals could return because of an action by her.
One thing we haven't talked about on the Kinder Morgan thing, we don't usually get into federal, but a good question here from Bill Thielman about the one federal risk associated with the Prime Minister's decision. Here he is.
Premier John Horgan came out of the Kinder Morgan pipeline meetings in Ottawa with Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Notley of Alberta in very good shape. But it's Justin Trudeau who looks like he's in the most trouble. With 18 seats in British Columbia, his MPs could be at risk under the Kinder Morgan decision. Do you agree?
Well, you're not seeing an opinion poll showing some support, but I mean, does Trudeau have to worry about that, or has he got to get this pipeline underway?
Well, it's interesting, that Angus Reid poll, regional breakdown, there's a little more support for the pipeline than opposition in Metro Vancouver, which is where almost all his ridings are. He won a number of those ridings by huge margins, 40, 50 points over the NDP, which would be the party that would likely benefit from any decrease in the federal Liberal vote. So some of those ridings may be at risk that were tight races, but some of them were won by pretty hefty margins. The federal NDP is not in great shape right now. You're not going to vote for the Conservatives because you disagree about the pipeline. I mean, the Conservatives want to build the pipeline as well. So the NDP is going to have to poach votes from him on this issue. And I don't think the polling suggests that he's going to lose a majority of those 18 seats he currently holds. But he probably will lose at least a handful.
It's interesting, though, that John Horgan's main ally in this right now across the country is Quebec. Mm-hmm. And he does have to worry about seats in Quebec. Those and that's why when Energy East was canceled last fall, There were some people saying, oh, well, that's a big problem. But it all then came back to BC needing to have this pipeline put through because that was the only route for Alberta oil. So now you've got Quebec as the one that is backing BC in this fight, saying if the federal government legislates with a hammer, which is what they're threatening to do, something that says we will have supreme power over these issues, Quebec is going to be questioning that, and I think they will be picking a fight with John Horgan's big brother.
Well, so 20 years doing this show, we got people to send in a few questions about a few more general things that have happened over the years and some of the history we've all seen. So let's start with Bruce Halser. Here he is.
BC used to have a reputation in Canada for crazy politics, crazy politicians, bigger-than-life personalities. I think that really changed with the beginning of the Gordon Campbell government, and we probably have a little more sober politics, even in our minority situation, than Ontario does. But I wonder, looking back to the Dave Barrett, Bill Bennett era, who you would say have been the most effective leaders in British Columbia in the last 40 years, and maybe which leaders you think have been the least effective?
So I would just note that most of the premiers that I've covered did not survive in office long enough to get themselves reelected. And if they won an election, they weren't even around at the next election. There are exceptions to that. Christy Clark managed to make it to the next election, though she wasn't able to hold on power. Gordon Campbell got himself reelected. But most British Columbia premiers in our long history are one-term premiers. Some of them got a lot done. Dave Barrett's one of them, but there's an awful lot of one-term wonders, and some of them that weren't that wonderful in their one term. But I'll turn it over to you. You can get your reaction.
Well, I think effectiveness can be measured partly if you're reelected and by your legislative record. And on that basis, I think Bill Bennett, I caught the tail end of him. Yeah. I think he has to be ranked as an effective leader. I think Gordon Campbell, he won 3 times. He's it ended badly with the HST. But I think you can argue he was a fairly effective political leader throughout most of his 3 terms. As you mentioned, the one-term one, it's hard to judge Mike Harcourt or Glenn Clark or Ujjal Dosanjh, Dan Miller, even Rita Johnson, even Christy Clark. In terms of ineffective leadership, I would say Bill Vander Zalm, because he presided over the destruction of his own political party, largely not so much partly by his policies, but also just the internal machinations and his going down a path towards social conservatism and marrying religious views with public policy. It was the seeds of destruction. It destroyed a political dynasty. That has to rank as the most ineffective leadership of all.
And I think if you look at not so much about being reelected, but what you did, what your legacies are. Obviously, Dave Barrett and Bill Bennett have legacies that last to this day. Dave Barrett, of course, in 3.5 years created ICBC and all these other things that we still have today. I think Christy Clark will be able to look back on things like the Great Bear Rainforest deal. It took 20 years to negotiate. She was the one that brought that one home. That will last. The war in the woods that Mike Harcourt had to deal with, there are lasting implications to that.
Glenn Clark would point to the Niska Treaty, the first modern First Nations treaty.
Yeah.
And so even some of them that didn't last very long have some things they can point to.
I was only referring to premiers that we've covered, sort of thing.
That's true. Dave Barrett.
W.C. Bennett was a visionary as well. And I think Vaughn was the only one of us 3 who covered him.
I did a little more to Cosmos too, and he certainly did a figure. I think the only BC premier who was ever declared insane, or you might say the only one for whom we ever did the paperwork on. But anyway, let's go to the next question. Jordan Bateman, this is a good question, although maybe get us to say something nice about somebody we just took a shot at. But here's Jordan Bateman.
Over the past 2 decades, you've seen a lot of politicians come into that house, many of whom retired shortly thereafter, some of whom are still there. Was there anyone who really surprised you? Who really took to politics that you weren't expecting to?
I was surprised by Andrew Weaver. Now, he's had a bit of a rough time on this show, and he's hitting some bumps in the road, but I was surprised that the guy who went to international conferences and had all these degrees and everything seemed to really like politics and take to it. So that's the one that jumped to my mind right away.
What about Adrian Dix? We thought when he launched into running as a politician This is the guy that had all this baggage as a backroom boy in the Glenn Clark government, the memo to file, you know. How could somebody who had been so involved in the backroom and tainted by that time in politics want to come back, put himself out for public? He was very awkward, introverted, had a difficult time as leader of the NDP. Let that victory slip away, their best chance at getting into government in decades. And then he's become, I think he was a very effective opposition critic, did very well, worked hard, had a lot of respect from the cabinet ministers that he was up against. And now as health minister, I think actually he will probably get a lot done in a ministry that's very difficult to shift.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, Dix is a good choice. I'm not really sure what measuring stick Jordan's applying here, but I would go back to someone who was sort of a junior politician rookie in the 1990s, who's now emerged as a big player in this government. That's Mike Farnworth, who's been around a long time, is now very much in charge of the government's legislative agenda. I think was very effective in opposition. And when I first met him in the 1990s, it wasn't the type of guy necessarily I thought, well, you're going to emerge as the dominant person in a caucus down the road. And he was a leadership candidate. He sort of found his stride after they were out of power in 2001 when he came back. So that was one of, I think, his but I think Dix is a good choice too.
Biggest transformation I've seen going from opposition to government, Keith already referred to it, John Horgan.
Yeah.
You wondered how he was going to manage days in opposition. He's having the time of his life as Premier of British Columbia. That could change. You get in government for a while, and maybe the old John Horgan will come back, but at the moment he's doing very well. Let's go to Jock Finlayson. This one, there's so much competition for this one. Let's go to Jock. Here it is.
Looking at the turbulent history of BC politics, I wonder if you could identify for us what you see as the biggest public policy fiasco in British Columbia in the last quarter century.
Well,
so much to choose
I won't. I'll let you guys go first on this one because I'm still mulling in my head which one I'm going to pick.
I would pick the HST.
That's what I was going to pick.
It's an easy one, I know. Yeah. There are merits to bringing in a harmonized sales tax, but it was so badly implemented by the Campbell government in a panic. In a state of panic, it was just badly botched. And the only one that would rival that, and the NDP watch, would be the fast ferry fiasco. But I don't think that comes in magnitude to the HSC, because the fast ferries didn't cost the Premier his job. Other things came into play there. But the HST cost Gordon Campbell his job as Premier. That's a pretty big stake to pay.
Mike Harcourt mishandled the Bigelow affair so badly that the party basically served him with an eviction notice. So that was bad, and he had nothing to do with it. I agree. The point on the HST, I would say, is that the tax did have merit, and it was appallingly handled. I'll throw out Van der Zalm and abortion.
I was going to say that's the other one.
It was an utterly meritless thing that he did with no public policy work at all. And it not just finished off his political career, but destroyed the whole party.
You guys have taken all the best. It's all the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? I mean, there's
Fast Ferry's pretty bad.
Fast Ferries was, and Keith touched on that one. Yeah. In terms of the public anger over anything, and that was when we were just starting to get email. Actually, this is really dating it, right? But I remember just this email coming in, and people. One was just, he ought to be shot was the subject line, and that was all there was to the email. And
what was this on?
This was on Fast Ferries. Fast Ferries. People were just so upset about it. I think Van der Zalm managed to, his comeback was on campaigning against the harmonized sales tax. And that one, again, was very divisive and very, people were very upset about this tax.
The abortion one with Van der Zalm, you're right, that was incredibly divisive. And it helped tear that party apart. So in some ways, I guess that was bigger than HST. I mean, it cost Campbell his job, but that particular policy cost a political party its existence.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with the media panel. We'll be right back with some fascinating snapshots.
How many hair colors did I have?
We look like teenagers there.
Looking at that montage, a couple that I just was touched to see, dear, sweet Norman Ruff, who was such a great guest on the show and who left us last year, and Dave Barrett was very generous about his time coming onto the show, and it was one of the last long interviews that he did. Dave's health was deteriorating even then, and I know Rod Mickelberg and Jeff Meggs, who did the book on Dave, said it was one of the last long interviews they could find with him. People were, of course, very generous with their time coming onto this show. There aren't a lot of shows where you get a full hour, and we've always tried to follow the rule on this show that let the guests do most of the talking, don't let the hosts do most of the talking. We have a second montage, however, that we're going to run. And this is, I think, just some premieres on the show, so let's go to that. And Keith and Justine can talk over the top of it. So, premieres, let's go. Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and tonight on the show is the Premier of the province,
Dan Miller. Now I see Dan Miller in Thrifties pretty well every weekend, and
he's a good Premier.
He was, and still very much engaged in politics. And that was a great interview he did with Barrett.
I love the way that these pictures show the success over the years of my dieting.
This is, of course, Mr. Vanderzam.
Vanderzam, yeah.
Vanderzam sent me a note the other day because he suddenly discovered Twitter and there's a fake Vanderzam account. He wanted to know how to get rid of it.
Oh dear,
Like
you're the expert on Twitter,
yeah,
right?
Harper on, good guess. Very more thoughtful after he left office. He was always seemed a bit nervous in office.
Much more comfortable once he
Gordon
left
Campbell, very awkward in opposition, but still a tough guy to get to know when he was Premier, I found.
Yeah.
Very academic.
Love to talk about policy.
Yeah,
right?
policy wonk.
Yeah.
Christy Clark, of course.
Practically climbed through the camera.
Yeah, very good on camera. Very good communicator.
Watching her against John Horgan in the last election campaign in those debates.
So John Horgan is the most frequent guest on this show other than tonight's media panel. 17 appearances. Very generous.
I hosted the show twice with him when he was...
very generous with his time, the Premier. Gift of gab, and a lot of policy on the show that he talked about over the years. A few more questions left in the time that's left, and just I picked a few things that are been a big deal. The first one is a constant in this job since I started, still the most difficult public policy issue in British Columbia, still the most unresolved, still the one on which, though we've made some progress, we haven't made nearly enough. Troy Sebastian with a question about it. Here's Troy.
There has been so much change in the coverage of Indigenous issues and Indigenous peoples over the last 20 years. What is the one thing that has surprised you the most in terms of the change that we've seen in that time?
Well, I'm surprised that the treaty process, which had so much promise, has produced so few treaties.
Yeah, there has been, I think, a huge difference in the coverage and I think in the attitude of Canadians, the awareness of some of these issues that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah.
And people are starting, and every politician now stands up at the beginning of every news conference to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of whoever's the Indigenous community is from that place that we're in. And I think it's becoming much more of an accepted notion that there's something that is lingering that hasn't been fixed, that we've got to get past. We need to understand in order to move forward. And so that's been a positive change. I still see in newsrooms and in politics, we don't have the representation of Indigenous people. And I think until you actually have newsrooms that reflect Canadian society and legislatures that reflect, the commons that would reflect that, it's going to be hard to actually get to where we need to go.
And the courts have had to do an awful lot of pushing.
Yes, and I mean, there's been some court decisions as well, pivotal court decisions that have changed the landscape and have forced the media, I think, to take a closer look at some of the issues. Troy's point about the media coverage, unfortunately, media is shrinking in terms of resources. And I remember when all three of us were at the Vancouver Sun, we had, I think, 2 Native Affairs reporters as a beat. And that was a guaranteed source of coverage of issues relating to that area. And that's gone now. And you see very little of that specialized reporting in most major media. You're left with, I
think CBC does.
CBC does a bit, and there's a CTV program too, I think, called First Nation. But it's not like a daily basis because it's not just one news outlet anymore. It's people are getting their news from all sorts of places, and it's tough now when you don't have the resources available to cover it.
Ida Chong, good question here. This has turned. The other thing has turned our industry inside out, not just the loss of all the staff and the economics not working as well, but the rise of some competition. Here is Ida.
Keith and Justine, from when you began your journalistic careers till now, social media has certainly made a difference. How do you believe social media has changed how you have gotten your news or the topics that you wanted to discuss versus when you didn't have social media available at your fingertips?
Well, I mean, I'll start with some positive things.
Yes.
It is easier to find voices, not sort of the people that you talk to all the time that happen to be in what we used to call a Rolodex. And so because you've got all these people that are out there commenting on things, you can actually follow up and say, hey, there's somebody who's had that experience with that issue, and I can go out and contact them directly. So that's a positive. Obviously, the social media there's an echo chamber there. There's a lot of really nasty, negative stuff that goes on that I think really makes people reluctant to engage in public debates. And that's the ugly side of it that I think I wish we could do without.
Yeah, you want to see ugliness? Look at my Twitter thread sometimes. It's, 30,000 followers, and some of them are very abusive. But it's also a very useful medium. As Justine says, it's a place to get information and a very quick access and to contact people very quickly. You don't need their email address. You can get a direct message on Twitter. So I do a lot of reporting, old-fashioned reporting through using social media to get information, to contact people, and not just social media, but the internet wasn't there when we started back in 1800s.
We didn't have cell phones.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many instances I've been under the gun on deadline to find out information about a topic I know nothing about, and you go to Google and you're an expert. in 3 minutes, and you can start spouting facts and figures and context at a time when it would have taken us hours in the past. So everything is faster now. Everything is more rushed, but the conversation is a bad one on social media. It's, as Justine said, it's an echo chamber, and people just refuse to. I don't know how many people on my Twitter feed today. I posted the Angus Reid poll, and because people disagreed with its findings because they were adamantly anti-pipeline, they branded it as fake news. And this is the other phenomena of social media. If you disagree with something, well, I'm just going to say it's fake news. It's not real, and that's a very harmful thing, I think, for democratic institutions and democratic debate.
Interesting too, because there doesn't seem to be any memory out there when the Angus Reid organization reported less than a month ago that John Horgan was the most popular premier in Canada, and the poll was attacked by people who don't like John Horgan as an obvious work of an NDP stooge. And so today, when he reports that support is actually rising for the pipeline and the government doesn't have as much support as it thinks on the pipeline, he's being attacked the other way. And it is that echo chamber phenomenon on social media. Now, there's lots of very intelligent people on social media. It's a great tool for gathering information and making contact with people, and we use it every day. So the only piece of advice I would ever give anybody on it is the same piece of advice I used to give people when there was just print, radio, and television, which is get your news and opinions from a variety of sources. Yes. Don't get it all from one person. And try to understand people that you disagree with once in a while, because they have their own reasons. I couldn't avoid this. I thought about avoiding it. I thought of just running out of time and skipping over it, but
you promised
Christina and Jason, who put this show together and do all the work on it, put this together. So here we go. Vaughn Palmer. God help me.
It's time to turn the tables a little bit on the interviewee. Vaughn Palmer has been a rock critic, city editor at The Sun, longtime legislative columnist. Justine and Keith, you've known him better than pretty much anyone else. What are your favorite Vaughn stories, and what don't we know about the man who's interviewed so many people over the years?
Well, my least favorite story is his refusal to even give me a job interview when he was a city editor. But the best story is they ended up hiring the woman who I later married, Ann Mullen. So he hired us Ann.
My judgment was impeccable.
Impeccable judgment. Refused to even give me an interview. I had to go another 2 years on the unemployment line because of his bad call at the. At least he made one good call as city editor. Hired Ann. One bad call. He refused to even look at my resume. Not that it was very big.
So 30 years ago, I came to the press gallery as I was lower than an intern. I had scraped together a little job that allowed me to show up and write for Canadian University Press. I had no standing, I had no backup, I had nobody to support me to tell me what I was supposed to be doing. It was my first budget lockup, and you came along and you sat down and said, "So, what do you think?" And it was actually something I always remember, because you've always been supportive and generous with your time and your knowledge, and you've been always willing to share that with other reporters and other people. But it's also the fact that you listened to other people and you wanted my perspective on it, even though I thought I had absolutely nothing to offer for somebody who was so experienced even then.
I've never figured out how to work a tape recorder.
Another story from the Bureau when we worked there. Gary Mason was working with us, Globe and Mail columnist, and Vaughn was doing his American radio show on our old Vancouver Sun phones with the three lines. You punch line one, line two. So Vaughn's on his radio show at this desk over here on the phone, and the phone rings, and it's Gary's wife, Barb, is on the phone. So I said, "Gary, line one." And in those days, you could go on each other's line. Gary presses the wrong button. As Vaughn is talking to Washington State, Gary gets on the phone, thinking he's talking to Barb, and thinking the baby, Jordan, is on the line, and starts saying, "Hi, honey. How's sweetie? How are you, little sweetie?" And suddenly, American viewers, and Vaughn's suddenly freaking out, going, get him off the air, get him off the air. I'm sure some Americans to this day are wondering, what the heck was that all about?
I've been very, very lucky in one enormous respect in that my main job, Vancouver Sun Victoria Bureau Chief, columnist, has had a whole string of very, very capable Vancouver Sun bureau chiefs, including the two people here, and Gary Mason and Rob Shaw, who I work with now, and a whole bunch of other people, Craig McInnes, that I worked with in the past. I think I counted them up once, and it was 9, which is almost as many premiers as I've covered. I keep driving them out. I think they get to the point where they can't stand me any longer and go on to something else, or they sit there like Baldrey and spend all their time scheming for how they can get their hands on the column, and I won't go away, so they go somewhere.
You're on to me.
But the press gallery is a really interesting institution because a lot of people come here and they stay here, and it builds up a level of knowledge and expertise that is handy. I was struck during the last teacher strike where the government was considering firing the school board, when reporters on the mainland phoned over to ask the education minister how it worked the last time. The education ministry said, talk to Baldrey and Palmer. They covered the last school board. So we end up occasionally getting referred to as a research department.
Yes.
So that's all the stuff. But it's a good gig over here in the press gallery. It's a nice place. And
well, your institutional memory comes in handy for so many people around the building. And you're right, it's not just the education ministry. There's politicians and staffers from time to time say, I had no idea, talk to Palmer.
And the best line about the press gallery I will give to former Cabinet Minister Joy McPhail, now chair of the board of ICBC. She said that the voters of British Columbia, in their wisdom, sometimes change the government, occasionally change the opposition, but unfortunately they've never changed the press gallery. So that's for the people out there that are unimpressed. We got time for one more question, and that is about a big deal that's coming up this fall. Well, do we have that wonderful picture of Vaughn Palmer? This beyond doubt that this was a geek. There was an NDP convention a few years ago where they sold a button that said Vaughn Palmer was a geek in high school, and still is in some people's minds. Yes, that's me as rock critic. Okay, all right, enough. Now let's go to Tillman. This is a good question. Time for Tillman.
Keith and Justine, the proportional representation referendum takes place by November 30th, and yet we have no alternative proposal for an electoral system which would incorporate proportional representation. We don't know if it could be MMP, STV, MMM, or EIEIO. When are we going to hear anything?
Well,
I'm hearing that we will get the details of what the questions will be in the next few weeks. Now, we've got a very busy legislative session. We've talked about some of the bills that we still haven't seen. There's still quite a few going through the House, but that's one of the big ones that they still have to do. And we're waiting for the reference question on Kinder Morgan. So there's still a lot of stuff going on.
And the debate on PR really hasn't started yet.
No.
I think it'll.
Bill's been out there.
In the summer. Yeah.
Bill's out there leading the anti-PR campaign, or co-leading it with Bob Fleckis and Suzanne Anton. He's been very successful at this in the past. I think I've talked to him a number of times. He does think his work's the hill's a little climber to push that boulder up this time, but all depends on the question and the rules, and we haven't really seen a lot of info. And Justine's right. I mean, we're getting pretty crowded in the legislature right now, and time is running out. So I'm not sure how much the government can push onto its agenda in any real tight time frame. I still think the flurry of activity in this is going to be in the fall, just before the vote.
And I think the debate. Well, the interesting thing to me about the debate will be whether it turns into a debate about proportional representation, or does it turn into a debate about the government? Because to some degree, Weaver and Horgan both tend to campaign for this. They're going to make a big issue of it. They want it to pass. And then you go, do I like how this partnership is working? And I wonder if some days that Weaver isn't undermining it by the way he's acting.
Yeah, well, that's why the whole, whether he's going to pull the government down, he's got to be thinking about that, and whether if he really wants this change to happen, he has to make this government work.
And time's up on Voice of BC tonight, and I just want to say a couple of things to mark this. First of all, my friends Justine and Keith, for all the expertise they've loaned to this show over the years. 20 years, 40-some shows a year. That's an awful lot of guests and an awful lot of people watching at home. I appreciate that. And the other thing is, I really do have to say appreciation to Christina and Jason, who do all the work putting this together, assemble all the clips, put up with my inability to stop clicking my pen and look at the right camera and not lose my voice. It's been a blast, and thank you folks at home for watching Voice of BC. As long as we could, bringing the legislature and BC politics into your living room Good night.
The following is a community access program. While